The fire is dying. Not out, just low. The coals have been breathing for hours, holding their heat through the night, and the man sitting beside them has been awake longer than that. His name doesn't matter. He lived somewhere in what we now call the Fertile Crescent, roughly 40,000 years before anyone thought to write anything down. And right now he is doing something that looks, from a distance, almost identical to something you probably did this morning. He is inhaling smoke deliberately. Not because a fire got out of hand. Not because the wind shifted. He leaned in, over a bundle of smoldering leaves packed into a hollow bone, and he breathed the smoke down into his chest on purpose. Then he held it. Then he let it go. The bundle is a plant called Nicotiana, one of the wild tobacco species that grew across the ancient world long before any farmer planted a row. Humans did not invent smoking. They discovered it, the way they discovered everything else that mattered, by paying close attention to what the natural world was already doing, and then figuring out how to use it. The question is when. When did that first deliberate inhalation happen? When did the transition from "this smoke repels insects" to "I am choosing to breathe this" actually occur? And what did it mean, biologically, socially, ritually, for the people who did it? If this is already landing, subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The assumption most people carry is that smoking is a post-Columbian habit, something Europeans picked up from the Americas in the 1500s and then spread around the world through trade routes and colonial expansion. And that story is partly right. The global tobacco industry, the clay pipe, the cigar, the cigarette, all of that moves through the European encounter with the New World. But the story of humans deliberately inhaling smoke from psychoactive plants is not a 500-year-old story. It is not even a 5,000-year-old story. The archaeological record now points to something far older than that, and far stranger, and it forces a completely different question. Not when did humans start smoking, but why did they ever stop thinking it was sacred? To understand this, you have to start with the plant itself. There are roughly 70 species in the genus Nicotiana. Most people know one, the domesticated tobacco that fills commercial cigarettes today. But the wild ancestors of that plant were growing across both the Americas and in ancient populations worldwide for millions of years before any human touched them. In the Americas specifically, wild tobacco was available across a vast range, from the American Southwest down through Mesoamerica and into South America. Nicotine is not, from the plant's perspective, an invitation. It is a pesticide. The tobacco plant produces nicotine specifically to poison insects that try to eat it. The compound attacks the nervous system of any creature small enough for a leaf's worth of it to be lethal. The fact that humans found a dose that produces stimulation rather than death is one of those narrow biological accidents that change the trajectory of an entire species. Nicotine binds to acetylcholine receptors in the human brain, the same receptors involved in attention, arousal, and the release of dopamine. At small doses, it sharpens focus, reduces appetite, and produces a mild euphoric calm. The brain registers it as meaningful, as something to seek again. The question is not whether ancient humans would have discovered this. The question is how quickly. And the answer, based on current archaeological evidence, is much faster than anyone assumed. In 2021, archaeologists excavating a site in the Escalante Desert in Utah made a find that rewrote the timeline. Inside a small stone hearth, roughly 12,300 years old, they found the charred seeds of wild tobacco plants mixed with the ash of other burned materials. The seeds alone do not prove smoking. Tobacco seeds can scatter into a fire from a nearby plant. But the specific context mattered. The hearth appeared to be a deliberate processing site, not a cooking fire. The seeds were not mixed with food remains. They were mixed with the kind of material signature that shows up at sites associated with ritual use. Burned animal bone fragments, red ochre, and objects that had been arranged rather than discarded. This was, by the best reading of the evidence, a place where people were doing something intentional with a psychoactive plant more than 12,000 years ago. That is 4,000 years before the oldest Egyptian pyramid, 6,000 years before Stonehenge was finished. It is not an isolated find. Across dozens of archaeological sites in the American Southwest and the Great Basin, researchers have found wild tobacco seeds in contexts that suggest deliberate use rather than accidental presence. At Antelope Cave in Arizona, the remains of a smoking pipe carved from a bird bone were found alongside tobacco residue and dated to roughly 3,000 years ago. But the pipe's construction suggests a technology that had already been refined over a long period. You do not build a well-designed tool on the first attempt. Behind every pipe there is a history of pipes, Behind every pipe is a history of burning the plant without one. So we are dealing with a behavior that is genuinely ancient. But ancient for what purpose? This is where the assumption collapses most completely. Modern culture frames smoking in almost exclusively medical and recreational terms. Addiction, health risk, stress relief, social habit. What the archaeological record shows when you look at it without those frames is something different. In nearly every ancient culture where deliberate smoke inhalation has been documented, from the Americas to the ancient Near East to sub-Saharan Africa to the steppes of Central Asia, the behavior was not primarily about recreation. It was primarily about contact with what was on the other side of ordinary perception. In 2019, a research team led by archaeochemist Kobi Ilani analyzed residue from ancient incense burners found at the site of Tel Arad in the Negev desert. The burners date to around 700 BCE, and what the analysis found inside them was cannabis resin and frankincense, both psychoactive when burned, both inhaled during what the archaeological context suggests were ritual practices inside a shrine. This was deliberate. These were not campfire accidents. These were purpose-built ceramic vessels designed to hold burning psychoactive plant material in an enclosed space where people were present. The same pattern shows up on the Eurasian steppe. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Scythian practice of throwing hemp seeds onto heated stones inside small enclosed tents and inhaling the vapor, and he described the people who did this as reacting with cries of pleasure. For a long time, historians treated this as one of Herodotus's exaggerations. Then, in 1929, a burial mound in southern Russia was excavated and found to contain a portable inhaling apparatus, a small brazier and a tent frame, along with hemp seeds. Herodotus was describing something real, and recent analysis of ancient Scythian burial sites at Pazyryk in the Altai region confirmed cannabis residue in vessels that appear to have been used in mortuary rituals, some dated to around 500 BCE. But here is what the dates and the residues and the pipes and the hearths are collectively pointing toward. This is not a behavior that humans invented once and spread from a single origin point. Multiple cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, independently arrived at the same fundamental practice. They found a plant that, when burned and inhaled, changed what the mind could access, and they built rituals around it. The reason for that convergence is biological. Every human brain has the same acetylcholine receptors. Every human brain responds to nicotine in roughly the same way. The brain of the man sitting by the dying fire in the Fertile Crescent was functionally identical to the brain of a hunter in the Escalante Desert and a shaman on the Eurasian steppe. The plants were different. The rituals were different. The underlying neuroscience was the same. And because it was the same, humans in radically different environments kept arriving at similar conclusions about what the smoke was for. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. The most documented ancient smoking culture is the one that existed across North and South America before European contact, and it is worth spending time here because the detail is specific enough to correct a story that most people have badly wrong. The default image is the peace pipe, a Hollywood artifact, vague and ceremonial and stripped of context. The reality was considerably more complicated. Among the indigenous peoples of the American Southwest, tobacco was not a single, undifferentiated substance. Different species were used for different purposes. Nicotiana rustica, sometimes called Aztec tobacco or strong tobacco, contains nicotine concentrations 3 to 8 times higher than the commercial Nicotiana tabacum that fills modern cigarettes. At those concentrations, the effects are not mild stimulation. They are, at sufficient doses, visionary. The plant produces what ethnobotanists describe as a dissociative state, a loosening of the ordinary boundary between self and environment, accompanied by vivid sensory intensification. This is not metaphor, this is neurochemistry. At high nicotine concentrations, the cholinergic system is pushed past the threshold of simple stimulation into something closer to the effects associated with other psychoactive compounds. The people who used Nicotiana rustica were not smoking casually. They were using it the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely for a specific purpose, with an understanding of dose and effect that had been accumulated across generations. Among the Huichol people of northwestern Mexico, ritual tobacco use was, and remains, in living practice, inseparable from the ceremony of connecting with the spiritual world. The Mara Akame, the shaman, uses tobacco not to relax but to work. The smoke is understood as a vehicle, a carrier, something that opens a door that ordinary consciousness cannot reach. This is not a peripheral belief. It is structural. The tobacco is not supplemental to the ritual, it is the ritual's engine. The same functional understanding appears in the archaeological record of cultures that had no contact with Mesoamerica. Across the eastern woodlands of North America, stone and clay pipes have been recovered from burial mounds of the Hopewell culture, dated between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE. These pipes were not everyday objects. They were carved with extraordinary care, animal effigies, geometric precision, deliberate aesthetic investment. Objects made with that level of craft are not made for casual use. They are made for occasions that matter. The pipe itself was sacred because what it facilitated was sacred, the conversion of a plant into smoke, and the inhalation of that smoke by a person who was, in the understanding of the culture, briefly in contact with something larger than ordinary daily life. What the archaeological record cannot tell us, honestly, and this is worth saying plainly, is exactly when this understanding first crystallized. We have the 12,300-year-old hearth in Utah. We have residue analyses and pipe fragments that cluster in the 3,000 to 5,000 year range across multiple continents. We have the much older genetic evidence that wild tobacco was present and accessible to humans for tens of thousands of years before any of those finds. What we do not have is the moment, the first deliberate inhalation, the first time a person leaned over a burning plant and understood, or began to understand, what was happening to their mind. Researchers genuinely debate this. Some argue the 12,300-year-old Utah hearth is not conclusive, that charred seeds in a fire pit could reflect any number of behaviors that fall short of deliberate psychoactive use. Others point to the pattern, the repeated association of tobacco and cannabis and other psychoactive plants with ritual sites, burial contexts, and specialist artifacts across multiple independent cultures, and argue that the consistency is itself the evidence. When the same behavior shows up in the same specialized contexts across cultures with no contact with each other, the most parsimonious explanation is that the behavior reflects something real and discovered, not invented once and spread. Discovered, repeatedly, because the plant was there and the brain was there and the two of them, in contact, produced a reliable result. There is a detail about ancient tobacco use that almost never makes it into the popular version of this story, and it changes the picture considerably. In the ancient world, across cultures that used psychoactive smoke deliberately, the person doing the inhaling was almost never a random member of the group. It was a specific person, a specialist, someone whose social role was defined, in part, by their trained relationship with the plant and what it did to perception. This matters because it means the behavior was not casual from the beginning. It was curated. The knowledge of which plant, at what dose, burned in what way, in what context, for what purpose. That knowledge was held by individuals who spent years acquiring it. Ethnobotanist Weston LaBarre, who studied tobacco use across indigenous American cultures for decades, documented that in many groups the shaman's relationship with tobacco began in adolescence and involved a period of deliberate instruction, learning the plant's properties, its dangers, its correct applications, before any formal ritual use. This is not what addiction looks like. This is what expertise looks like. The dose distinction is crucial and rarely discussed. The nicotine concentrations in wild and semi-cultivated tobacco used by ancient cultures were, in many cases, high enough to be genuinely dangerous if used incorrectly. Nicotiana rustica, at full concentration, can produce nicotine poisoning in an inexperienced user. Nausea, vomiting, disorientation, cardiovascular stress. The narrow band between a dose that opens perception and a dose that incapacitates a person is not wide. Navigating it required knowledge. The specialist held that knowledge. The group depended on the specialist to hold it correctly. This is a pattern that runs through ancient relationships with psychoactive plants more broadly, and it explains something that initially seems paradoxical. Why did so many ancient cultures treat these plants as sacred rather than simply useful? The answer is that sacred and useful were not separate categories. The plant was treated with reverence because it was genuinely powerful, because misusing it had real consequences, and using it correctly produced real results. The ritual frame was not decoration. It was the delivery system for the knowledge of how to use the thing safely. When you look at the archaeological evidence for ancient smoking through this lens, several finds that seem strange suddenly make sense. At the site of Javín de Huántar in Peru, a ceremonial complex occupied between roughly 1200 and 200 BCE, archaeologists found evidence of psychoactive plant use, including tobacco and San Pedro cactus, in the context of a space specifically designed to produce altered sensory experience. The galleries inside the main temple structure are narrow, dark, and acoustically engineered to distort perception. Sounds echo from unpredictable directions. Disorientation builds as you move through the passages. The people who built this place understood something precise about how the human mind works under psychoactive influence, and they built an architecture that amplified and directed the experience. This is not casual. It is the product of generations of accumulated knowledge about the relationship between the brain, the plant, and the built environment. The same sophistication appears in a different form at sites associated with the ancient Maya. Ceramic vessels painted with scenes of tobacco use, figures blowing smoke, tubes held to the mouth, bundles of leaves prepared for burning, have been found at sites dating to around 600 CE. But the iconography itself references practices that were already, by that point, clearly ancient within the culture. The Maya word for tobacco, pique, appears in ritual texts alongside words for breath, soul, and communication with the dead. The plant was understood as a medium, a transmitter, something that carried a message between the living and wherever the dead went. That understanding, tobacco as medium, appears in one form or another in nearly every ancient culture where deliberate smoking has been documented, which raises a question that is genuinely hard to answer from the archaeological record alone. Did the belief shape the use, or did the use produce the belief? The neurological case for the second option is stronger than most people realize. Nicotine at elevated doses does not merely relax or stimulate. It alters the quality of perception in ways that are, to a person experiencing them without a scientific framework, genuinely difficult to explain in ordinary terms. Colors intensify. The sense of self-boundary softens. Time perception shifts. Sounds acquire unusual salience. A person sitting by a fire in the ancient Fertile Crescent, having inhaled a significant dose of wild tobacco smoke for the first time, would have had an experience that their existing vocabulary could not adequately describe. The most honest interpretation available to them would have been, something outside ordinary life is present here. Something is communicating through this smoke. They were not wrong exactly. Something was communicating. It was their own cholinergic system, speaking in a register it did not normally reach. But the interpretation that the smoke opened a channel to something beyond ordinary perception was a reasonable inference from an experience that ordinary life did not prepare them to explain otherwise. And once that interpretation existed, it became the framework that shaped every subsequent use. The ritual is not separate from the pharmacology. The ritual is what the pharmacology looked like, understood by people who had no pharmacology. This is the turn that the evidence leads to, and it is worth slowing down here because it is more specific than it first appears. We tend to think of the history of smoking as a history of a habit, something people did compulsively, recreationally, addictively, that was later discovered to be harmful and gradually stigmatized. That is the modern story. But it is a recent story. For the overwhelming majority of human history, for the tens of thousands of years during which humans and psychoactive plants were in contact, the frame was entirely different. Smoking was not a habit, it was a technology. A tool for reaching a specific cognitive state that was understood to have specific functions, sharpening the shaman's perception, facilitating communication with the ancestors, marking the boundary between ordinary time and ritual time, binding a group together around a shared altered experience. The commercial cigarette, the mass-produced, constantly available, casually consumed delivery vehicle for addictive doses of refined nicotine, is so recent in evolutionary terms as to be essentially brand new. The first commercial cigarette factory opened in 1881. The filtered cigarette became dominant in the mid-20th century. What we think of as smoking, culturally, is a 150-year-old phenomenon. What we think of as addiction to tobacco is largely a consequence of the refinements that came with industrialization. The breeding of higher nicotine varieties, the addition of chemical additives that accelerate absorption, the design of a delivery mechanism so efficient and so available that the brain never has time to re-establish equilibrium between doses. Ancient tobacco use was not like this. The plant was seasonal. The doses were inconsistent. The contexts were specific. You did not smoke Nicotiana rustica on your way to work. You used it in a defined circumstance, with a defined purpose, under the guidance of someone who knew what they were doing with it. The relationship between the human and the plant was managed, bounded, intentional. The addiction model, the one that frames all tobacco use, ancient and modern, as fundamentally about chemical dependence, flattens a far more complex picture into something it can measure. What the archaeological record shows, across cultures and millennia, is something that looks less like compulsion and more like a negotiated relationship. The plant offered something real, a reliable alteration of perception, a reduction of pain, a sharpening of focus, a social binding mechanism. The cultures that used it offered something in return: ritual, restraint, specialist knowledge, and a framework that kept the relationship from collapsing into pure dependency. That negotiation lasted for most of human history. What changed was not the plant. What changed was the removal of every constraint that had governed the relationship for thousands of years. The ritual context, the specialist gatekeeper, the seasonal availability, the deliberate dosing. When those constraints disappeared, what was left was the pharmacology alone. And the pharmacology, without structure around it, does exactly what the ancient specialists had always understood it could do if handled carelessly. It takes over. Look again at the man by the fire in the Fertile Crescent. He is not doing what the person on a smoke break outside a glass office tower is doing. They are inhaling the same basic compound, delivered into the same basic biological system. But the context is different in every other way. He is sitting in a specific place, at a specific hour, after specific preparation. The smoke rising from the bundle in his hand is not casual. It is the oldest technology humans ever built for accessing a part of their own minds that ordinary daily life did not reach. He knows what he is doing, or he is in the presence of someone who does. The question the evidence leaves you with is not really about tobacco. It is about the relationship between knowledge and constraint, about what happens when a tool that was designed to be used carefully is redesigned to be used constantly, by everyone, all the time, with the careful parts removed. The answer to when ancient humans started smoking is far earlier than we knew, and with far more intention than we assumed. The answer to what they understood about what they were doing is more than we gave them credit for, and in some ways, more than we currently understand ourselves. The smoke was never just smoke. The people who first leaned into it knew that. We are still, in various ways, figuring out what to do with what they found. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.